Hello everyone, and welcome back to Deep Chronicles World. Before you cozy up and drift off into dreamland, why not drop a comment below and share where in the world you're tuning in from. And hey, if you're enjoying these stories as much as I love sharing them, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Now, let's get comfy, relax, and dive into tonight's tale. Ready? Let's begin. 4 armed robbers entered a bank in Argentina and took hostages. The police surrounded the place. After several hours of negotiation, the robbers announced they would surrender on one condition, that the police bring them pizza. The pizza arrived, but suddenly, the robbers cut off all communications with the police. The police decided to storm the bank, but inside, there was no one except the hostages. When they went downstairs, they found the bank vault looted, with no trace of the robbers or how they escaped. There was no tunnel in the ground or any visible exit. The police immediately suspected the hostages, thinking the robbers might be hiding among them. So, were the robbers really hiding among the hostages? Where did they go exactly? That's what we'll find out in today's story. Peace be upon you. In 2006, the largest bank heist in Argentina was executed. Sophisticated and complex operation. The robbers who carried out this heist were 4 individuals. The first was Fernando Araham, the leader of the operation. The second was the engineer. The third was Beto de la Torre, whom we'll call the financier. And the fourth was Luis, nicknamed the Violent One. There were also 2 others who helped them from the outside, though their identities remain unknown. We'll refer to them as the doctor and the kid. Remember these 4 names because I've given each of them a nickname to make it easier to follow the story. The story begins with Fernando, the leader and mastermind of the operation. One day, Fernando visited a psychologist and told him, "I want to rob a bank." The doctor was surprised, assuming Fernando was just talking nonsense under the influence of marijuana, which he frequently smoked. The doctor asked, "Why do you want to rob a bank? Is it for money?" Fernando replied, "No, I don't need money. But you know me, I'm an artist. I love art, and I feel like I can create a great masterpiece in the world of bank robberies." The doctor asked, "And how do you plan to execute this heist?" Fernando responded, "I don't know yet, but this idea consumes my entire being. I think about it before I sleep, after I wake up, and every moment of my day. I want to rob a bank." The doctor thought it was just the marijuana talking, but little did he know, Fernando was serious. He went on to execute the smartest and largest bank robbery in the streets of Buenos Aires, Argentina's capital. To explore potential targets, he scouted around and eventually found a bank called Banco Rio, located in a very wealthy area bank where the rich kept their valuables, money, and precious belongings. Fernando then began brainstorming ways to carry out the heist. The first method was to storm the bank while it was open, take the cash from the tellers, and leave quickly before the police arrived. However, this method was highly risky and offered limited gains. Since they wouldn't have time to raid the vault, they'd have to leave quickly before the police arrived. The second method was to break into the bank when it was closed, which typically involved taking a tunnel underground to reach the vault. But this method also had its problems. It could be easily discovered because the bank had heat sensors in advance, alarm systems that would detect intrusions into the vault while it was locked. Both methods were difficult and highly dangerous. Fernando realized that if he was going to risk everything, he needed to ensure the biggest possible payoff. This meant he would have to dig a tunnel to access the vault while the bank was closed. At first, considered renting a ground floor apartment or a warehouse near the bank and digging a tunnel from there to the vault. But then, Fernando stumbled upon a pleasant surprise during one of his reconnaissance trips. He noticed sewer grates. Along the street in front of the bank, every 10 meters or so, there was a manhole. This meant there was already an underground network passing directly in front of the bank. These tunnels led all the way to a drainage outlet about 150 meters from the bank. Fernando had found a ready-made tunnel. Without wasting time, Fernando entered the sewer system and began exploring. Initially, the tunnel was square-shaped, but after walking about 100 meters, he reached a circular tunnel about 6 meters in diameter. Massive underground passage extending beneath the city and running directly past the bank. Now, Fernando needed help because executing this operation alone was impossible. The first person who came to mind was his friend Poster, whom we'll call the engineer, was an expert in electronics and mechanics. Fernando approached him with the idea, was shocked because, as far as he knew, Fernando had no criminal history or experience in theft. All he knew was that Fernando loved art and marijuana. How could someone like this plan to rob a bank? But Fernando explained the details, the idea in his mind, and how they could reach the vault through the sewer tunnels. Began to seriously consider the idea. Even though he himself had never stolen anything in his life. However, his family had suffered greatly during a period when Argentina's banking system collapsed, losing much of their savings and never getting it back. Began to see the banks as the villains in the equation. If you robbed a bank, it wouldn't be unethical from his perspective, at least not entirely. The engineer told Fernando that he was in. Together, they went to the site of the bank, explored the sewer tunnel beneath it, began calculating exactly where they would need to dig down first. Fernando brought measuring tapes and started lowering them into the sewer grates. These tapes would help them determine their exact position and distance from the surface once they were inside the tunnel. Then they sneaked into the bank, took over photos, and observed the layout, including the vault in the basement. They estimated the size of the vault and the number of safety deposit boxes inside, hundreds of them. But despite all their calculations, everything was still approximate. They needed precise measurements, which required obtaining the blueprints of the bank building. These blueprints were likely stored in a municipal records office somewhere above all. They needed financial support because the tools planned to build would require money. Fernando, the leader, began searching for a new partner. To join their team, he contacted a person known only as the Doctor. This individual's identity remained unknown, and his role was more of a coordinator than an active participant in the operation. The Doctor told Fernando he would connect him with the right people to assist in the heist. The first person introduced was Beto Della Torre, whom we'll call the financier. Beto was a man with a criminal past, a gangster, and knowledgeable about weapons. Fernando, along with the Doctor, met Beto to explain the plan. Cato was excited to join, especially since the plan seemed straightforward. However, when asked about funding, Beto admitted he didn't have cash, but suggested selling a truck to finance the operation. With that, Beto became the third key member of the gang. The Doctor, as mentioned earlier, remained a mysterious figure and wasn't considered a core member, since he acted as a coordinator rather than an active participant. Fernando, the leader, still needed a fourth person, a strong, hands-on worker, as would be busy crafting tools and dealing with personal matters. Additionally, Beto, the financier, was older and slower, making him less suitable for physical tasks. The Doctor suggested another individual, Luis, nicknamed the Violent One. Luis was a seasoned gangster with extensive experience in correlated crimes and had served time in some of the toughest prisons. Despite his fiery temper, Luis was intelligent, skilled in acting and deception, and would play a crucial role in the operation. Now, the gang was complete. Fernando, the leader, the engineer, Beto, the financier, and Luis, the Violent One. The four of them delved into the details of the operation. They descended into the sewer tunnel together, reviewed their calculations, and finalized their plans. As previously mentioned, they needed precise measurements, which required obtaining the bank's blueprints. Surprisingly, Luis volunteered to retrieve them. "Leave it to me," he said confidently. True to his word, a few days later, he he returned with the blueprints, though no one knew how he obtained them. With the blueprints in hand, they calculated the exact location where they needed to dig inside the sewer tunnel, taking into account the tunnel's length and the angle at which they needed to tilt their path. They drew up a detailed map with all the necessary calculations for the digging operation. Next, they gathered the tools they needed: a diesel-powered generator, digging equipment, and large trolleys. They began digging alongside the sewer tunnel. Someone was always stationed above ground to monitor the situation and ensure the sound of digging didn't reach the outside. This digging process would take several months. Now, they had to address the next challenge: the heat sensors and alarm systems that would trigger if they detected body heat. To counter this, Sebastian designed special suits made from materials used for camping and mountain climbing. He also purchased a thermal camera to test whether it could detect body heat through the suits. While the suit idea worked, it was still risky. If they moved too much inside the vault or carried too many tools, the sensors might still pick up their heat signatures. Overall, the plan remained highly dangerous. Frustrated, Fernando continued to brainstorm alternative solutions. One day, a crazy idea struck him. Scazed. Until now, he had been fixated on robbing the bank while it was closed, entering through the tunnel and leaving unnoticed. But what if they combined both methods? Instead of using the tunnel for entry, they would use it for escape. By doing so, the heat sensors and alarms would become irrelevant. The police would surround the bank from the outside, unaware that the robbers would flee underground. Fernando believed he was the first person in the world to come up with this idea, though similar tactics had been used in other famous heists, such as the 1995 bank robbery in Germany by Khalid, the Brazilian. Regardless, Fernando shared the idea with his team, and they were all astonished and excited now. They needed to add weapons and equipment to their arsenal. Pito, the financier, took charge of acquiring the weapons, leveraging his gang connections and expertise in the field. Keep in mind, however, that these weapons had a unique feature we'll reveal it at the end of the story, so stay tuned. Over the course of about a year, they completed digging the tunnel and constructed a small dam inside the sewer tunnel. The purpose of the dam was to raise the water level to a certain height so they could use small inflatable boats inside the tunnel. They knew that carrying their loot on foot would be impossible, as half their bodies would be submerged in water, slowing them down significantly. The dam ensured the water level was high enough for the boats to move freely. Next, they planned their escape route. Initially, they considered fleeing toward the drainage outlet, but they soon realized that the police would likely head straight there once they understood what was happening. Instead, they studied the opposite direction and discovered it was a much better option. Along this route, there were hundreds of sewer grates spaced every 10 meters. After studying the reverse route, they identified a specific grate located about 200 meters from the bank. They decided to use a van, parking it directly above the chosen grate. High in the van's floor, they cut an opening that aligned perfectly with the sewer grate below. This way, they could emerge from the sewer directly into the van without being seen. True to plan, Beto acquired a small van and parked it in his garage. The gang gathered in his garage to modify the van and cut the hole in its floor. While they were working, Beto's wife walked in. Everyone turned to Beto and asked, "What's your wife doing here?" Beto reassured them, saying, "Don't worry, she knows nothing. Trust me, everything is fine." This was the first and only time the gang members met her. Another mysterious figure, known only as the Kid, was responsible for driving the van and waiting for them after the heist. Everything was nearly ready. The only thing left was figuring out how to quickly open the safety deposit boxes inside the vault. There were hundreds of boxes, and manually opening them would take too long. To solve this, the engineer created a hydraulic tool they nicknamed the cannon. This device could smash open a safety deposit box in just 7 seconds per box, allowing them to open approximately 400 boxes within 2 hours. Finally, after months of preparation, everything was set. The sewer tunnel they would enter through, the tunnel they dug leading to the bank, the vault containing the safety deposit boxes, and the basement tall, meticulously planned. 200 meters away was the sewer grate they would emerge from, with the modified van parked directly above it for their escape. The gang decided to execute the operation on January 13, 2006. The engineer was the only one who entered the sewer tunnel and positioned himself near the entrance of the tunnel they had dug. The small inflatable boats and tools, including the cannon, were ready. He climbed through the tunnel until he reached the wall of the bank behind the vault and waited for his teammates' signal. Meanwhile, Fernando, Beto, and Luis positioned themselves in front of the bank's entrance, ensuring everyone was in place. Once they confirmed everything was ready, they stormed the bank, weapons raised. They immediately took control of the customers and employees inside, ordering them to lie face down on the ground. The security guard in the monitoring room locked himself in and alerted the police. Within minutes, patrol cars arrived at the scene. At this point, Fernando began enacting a pre-planned performance he called the Coco Plan. The idea was to take one of the hostages, pretend to attempt an escape, but quickly return inside once they saw the police surrounding the area. The goal was to convince the police commander that the robbers were trapped with no other exit. Side the bank, the robbers had full control of the situation, except for one problem. The security guard remained locked in the monitoring room and was in direct contact with the police. If he saw them leaving, he would alert the police, ruining their escape. They tried negotiating with the guard. Luis, the violent one, assured him he wouldn't be harmed if he opened the door. But the guard refused, insisting he wouldn't surrender. Luis then grabbed one of the female bank employees, held a gun to her head, and threatened to kill her if the guard didn't comply. The guard remained steadfast, but the employee, who knew Luis from previous interactions, began pleading with the guard, crying and saying she wanted to see her daughter again. Moved by her tears, the guard finally relented. "Okay, I'll come out, but don't hurt anyone," he said, opening the door and surrendering his weapon. Luis thoroughly searched him, confiscated his phone, and instructed him to leave. The guard exited with his hands raised, surrendered to the police and special forces surrounding the area. The operation commander questioned the guard about the situation inside. The guard reported seeing 3 armed robbers holding approximately 30 hostages. He mentioned that one of the robbers was communicating with someone outside via phone. Meanwhile, Fernando contacted who was waiting in the tunnel outside the vault. Fernando instructed him to breach the wall, began drilling from the outside, and soon heard the sound of movement on the other side. It was Fernando, moving a filing cabinet that was positioned directly over the spot was working on. Every moment, feared they had drilled in the wrong place. Finally, entered the vault with the hydraulic tools and began opening the safety deposit boxes. The next 2 hours, they aimed to open as many boxes as possible, estimating around Sibai. Y and Fernando worked in the vault. Luis and Beto maintained control over the hostages upstairs, trying to stall the police for the full 2 hours they had planned. Luis, the violent one, was a master of deception and acting. His performance even caught the attention of the media covering the event live. They referred to him as the man in the gray suit. Even the operation commander was baffled by how this man spoke to them with such confidence. During one call, Luis said, "Look, we came to rob the bank and planned to escape quickly, but you surrounded us faster than expected. We don't want to hurt anyone, but now we don't know what to do." The commander, watching through binoculars, was amazed by Luis's composure. Luis continued, "Listen, I just got out of prison after serving 15 years, and this isn't my first robbery. I know how these procedures work, and things could get ugly for the hostages. Don't push us too far, Commander, now convinced Luis was in control, agreed not to escalate the situation. Among the amusing moments during the heist, Luis and Beto discovered that one of the hostages was an elderly woman celebrating her birthday. They went to the bank's small kitchen, brought out a cake, sang happy birthday to her, while the other hostages joined in, throwing flour on the floor. In the end, they told her they would give her a birthday gift at their release. True to their word, they let her go. This story was mentioned in several sources, adding to the strangeness of the event. Throughout the ordeal, Luis continued to mislead the police with creative stories, even pretending to be the gang's lawyer during a phone call. When the 2 hours were up, and Fernando, exhausted and overheated, emerged from the vault with as much loot as they could carry. They had collected a fortune that would last them a lifetime. Fernando contacted Luis, instructing him to begin the escape plan. Luis delivered the final act of deception, calling the police and requesting pizza before surrendering. He gave them the address of a distant pizzeria to buy them more time. After the call, Luis cut off all communication. He and Beto ordered the hostages to remain face down, threatening to shoot anyone who moved. Meanwhile, Fernando placed their weapons on a small mat on the floor before exiting through the tunnel. They covered the hole with a filing cabinet and placed a fake bomb to delay discovery. They quickly boarded the inflatable boats, transferred the loot, and navigated the sewer tunnel to the predetermined exit point. Climbing out through the grate, they entered the waiting van through the hole in its floor. The van, spacious enough to accommodate both the gang and their loot, drove away unnoticed. They headed to a safe house they had prepared in advance. Upon arrival, they unloaded the loot and immediately turned on the TV to watch the news, laughing as they saw the police still surrounding the bank, unaware of their escape. Eventually, the police discovered the hole behind the filing cabinet, but found only a fake bomb. Meanwhile, the gang relaxed at the safe house, celebrating their success. They divided the loot visually, as counting it would take too long. Their haul included a small mountain of cash, gold, and jewelry, estimated at $19 million, making this the largest bank heist in Argentina's history. Each member took their share and went their separate ways, vowing never to see each other again. For a while, they lived comfortably, but one of them, Beto, the financier, faced trouble shortly after. When Beto returned home, his wife and children eagerly awaited him, thrilled about their newfound wealth. That night, they celebrated lavishly. However, a few days later, Beto noticed one of the loot bags was missing from the storeroom. Upon inspecting it, he discovered a large bundle of cash was gone. Confronting his wife, she admitted to taking 5 or 6 small bags, approximately $300,000. Furious, Beto demanded she return the money, but she refused, leading to a heated argument. Eventually, Beto decided to hide the remaining loot elsewhere. Unbeknownst to him, his wife, driven by jealousy, went to the police and reported him, believing he had taken the money for a secret lover. Ironically, Beto loved his family deeply and would never betray them. Following Beto's arrest, the authorities gradually uncovered the identities of the other 3 robbers. Despite their efforts to evade capture, all 4 were eventually arrested. Fernando, the leader, was found hiding in a tent in a remote area, while Luis fled to Uruguay but was captured there. The engineer was the easiest to catch, apprehended in his own home. During their trial, it was revealed that most of the stolen goods were never recovered. The robbers had hidden them in secure locations and refused to disclose their whereabouts. Surprisingly, their sentences were relatively light, ranging from 9 to 15 years, but none served the full term. Fernando served about 6 years, while Beto served 8. The reason for the lenient sentences was that their weapons were fake, reducing the charges from armed robbery to unarmed robbery. The stolen money was never fully recovered, raising suspicions of secret deals between the robbers and authorities to secure early releases. The bank compensated the affected customers through insurance. Dramatic film and a documentary were made about the heist. In the documentary, the 4 robbers appeared unrepentant, proudly recounting their operation and seemingly living comfortable lives. What ultimately happened to the money remains unclear. That concludes our story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more incredible content. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care, Tatsi. You, tomorrow, 1984, in one of the American prisons. The guard responsible for the outer gate received a call from the prison supervisor. The supervisor informed him that there was a bomb in building number 1 and ordered him to open the prison gates, take a van, and bring it to the building immediately. This prison was surrounded by a fence, and the entrance consisted of 2 gates facing each other. Prison regulations prohibited both gates from being opened simultaneously. However, in an emergency involving a bomb in the building, contrary to the rules, the gatekeeper opened both gates at once. Subsequently, a van entered the prison, and upon reaching the building with the supposed bomb, a bomb squad emerged, clad in their heavy gear. One of them was spraying a fire extinguisher as if to cool the bomb to prevent it from exploding. The bomb squad placed the bomb in the van and quickly exited through the open gates. The guards watched this scene, believing they had averted disaster. But what they didn't know was that this was only the beginning of the calamity, because the bomb squad, consisting of 6 individuals who had just left through the open prison gate, were, in fact, inmates condemned prisoners. All of them murderers, some even serial killers. Now we have 6 dangerous murderers who have escaped from prison and are willing to do anything to maintain their newfound freedom. I don't need to tell you that the subsequent events were insane. To begin with, how did they manage to pull off such an elaborate hoax? Where did the bomb come from, and how did they escape their cells? Where did they get the guards' uniforms? If you want answers, stay tuned. The story begins with P-Source story takes place in the state of Virginia, USA, specifically at the Mecklenburg Correctional Facility. Known for its high security measures, was a special section where death row inmates were held, called Section C, located in Building 1. This is the section and building from which the condemned inmates escaped. The escape occurred on May 31st, 1984, at 11 p.m. Naturally, as soon as the operation was uncovered, general alert was triggered across all security agencies, police, the FBI, and even the governor's office. Everyone was awake. This was the first time in American history that death row inmates had escaped from prison. 6 murderers on the loose. There was no room for delay or leniency. They had to be captured immediately. The search began right after the escape was discovered. Helicopters filled the skies. Cars scoured the streets. Officers and dogs were deployed, and a gradual sweep of the area surrounding the prison commenced, spanning several kilometers. The military and National Guard were also alerted. The FBI in Virginia immediately sent their best investigators to handle the case. All officials were concerned about public safety. If any civilian encountered these fugitives, a disaster could ensue. These were murderers, sentenced to death, capable of killing anyone effortlessly, whether out of necessity or mere amusement. They had nothing to lose, no conscience, no fear of punishment, as they were already condemned to death. The lead investigator handling the case was confident they would eventually capture them sooner or later, but his fear was that innocent people might suffer before then. Naturally, search units were actively working. Police across the state were involved in the operation. Roadblocks and checkpoints were set up, and the search perimeter expanded as more time passed, increasing the likelihood that the inmates had traveled further. especially since they were in a vehicle. They could have gone in any direction: east, west, north, south. No one knew. Investigators desperately needed any clue that could lead them to their whereabouts. First, they went to Section C, from which the inmates had escaped. The section was in complete disarray, as mentioned earlier when the escape was initially discovered. They found the guards restrained and imprisoned in this section. The investigators entered the cells where the inmates had been housed and searched thoroughly, but found no evidence or clues indicating where the inmates might have gone. However, they did find knives and sharp tools the inmates had crafted within the prison and cleverly hidden. For instance, they found a knife embedded in the leg of one of the tables. Realizing that the escaped inmates were armed, albeit only with makeshift weapons like knives, heightened their danger level. After completing their search of the cells, the investigators turned to interrogate the guards of Section C, whom they found bound. Their first question was whether the guards had any information about where the inmates might have headed after escaping. Perhaps they overheard conversations among them or caught a word here or there. However, the guards denied hearing any specific plans or destinations discussed by the inmates while they were detained. They claimed the inmates never mentioned where they intended to go. Suspicions among the investigators began to shift towards the guards themselves. Perhaps one of them had aided the inmates, because the building or section from which the inmates escaped was supposed to be secure with robust security measures. The investigators knew that prison guards were among those most susceptible to bribery, especially given their meager salaries and grueling working conditions. Guards often complained about inmate abuse. Thus, the investigators sat down with the guards and inquired about what happened, how the inmates managed to detain them, take their clothes, and exit the building so easily. The guards explained that 2 months prior, one of the inmates in Section C had sent an anonymous letter to the State Attorney General's office. The letter warned of a bomb in Section C, claiming that some inmates planned to use it in an escape attempt. The letter was anonymous, and the sender's identity was unknown. It ultimately led the prison warden to order a group of supervisors and guards to conduct searches in Section C. They entered cell by cell, removing inmates and inspecting their belongings, even using sniffer dogs, but found no trace of a bomb or materials that could be used to make one. The anonymous letter sent by the inmate stated that the bomb was being prepared as part of an escape plan for some inmates, and included a strategy to seize the guards' uniforms and disguise themselves. It seems that this report wasn't genuinely from an anonymous inmate trying to expose a conspiracy, but rather from the same inmates planning the escape of fabricated alert to ensure that when they executed their bomb hoax would be readily believed. The guards now realized that some of them, or at least one, were complicit in the operation and had assisted the inmates. They began questioning each guard individually about the events leading up to the inmates' escape. Through witness statements and testimonies, the investigators started piecing together how the inmates managed their breakout. On the day of the escape, the inmates were in the prison yard engaging in permitted outdoor activities for a specified number of hours. That day, the inmates were playing basketball under the watchful eyes of 5 guards. One of the inmates, named Willie Turner, approached a guard along with another inmate. They told the guard they wanted to return to their cells, one feigning a knee injury and the other claiming he needed the restroom. You might think returning to their cells was normal and within their rights, posing no threat. In fact, quite the opposite would sacrifice their recreational time. The problem was that this action violated prison policies. Inmates were required to spend the entire allocated time for outdoor activities outside their cells. If one or some wanted to return, everyone had to go back together. These were the prison's policies. So, to allow only 2 inmates to return to their cells, 2 guards had to accompany them. As previously mentioned, only 5 guards were present, watching the inmates play. The issue arose because the guards were lax in enforcing some of the prison's policies. Consequently, 2 of the 5 guards accompanied the inmates, requesting to return to their cells, leaving the remaining inmates under the supervision of just 3 guards. This reduced the number of eyes monitoring the rest of the inmates, making it easier for one of them to make a move without drawing attention. When the outdoor activity period ended, the guards instructed the inmates to head back to the building they needed to return to their cells. As the inmates and the 3 guards were heading back, the guards weren't particularly attentive or focused. They weren't expecting any issues. They knew the guards didn't adhere to even the most basic protocols. Once things settled, the guards opened the cell area and ushered the inmates inside. They had successfully exited the gate area. Meanwhile, Clanton remained hidden in the bathroom, unnoticed. After a while, one of the guards attempted to open the bathroom door but couldn't, as Clanton was holding it shut from the inside. When this guard tried to inform the second guard responsible for the section's gate, he dismissed it, saying, "Find another bathroom." According to prison policy, if any door was locked or stuck, maintenance workers should have been called immediately to fix it or address the issue. Yet, this protocol was ignored by the guards. Building 1 in the prison contained 3 sections: Section A, Section B, and Section C. Section C housed the death row inmates and was divided into 2 cell areas separated by a room controlling the gates. Inside this room was the guard responsible for operating the gates. According to this guard, the inmate's escape plan began when one of them tapped on the window to get his attention. This inmate had a book and, according to the guard, wanted to give it to another inmate in the second cell area of Section C. Thus, the inmate communicated with the guard via the phone, connecting the cell area to the gate control room. He said he wanted to give the book to James Briley, one of the murderous brothers we discussed earlier. The gate guard replied, "All right, I'll give him the book." So, he exited the control room, leaving the door slightly ajar. Habit of this particular gate guard. The inmates noticed this habit and decided to exploit it in their plan. Meanwhile, inside the cell area, the inmates were preparing themselves for the escape. One of the inmates, Willie Turner, was skilled in crafting handmade items. He could fashion knives and sharp weapons from scratch, using metal from bathrooms or door edges, sharpening them with stones. He had countless methods to create these knives and clever ways to hide them in books, cables, and places difficult for guards to discover. Investigators believe he was the mastermind behind the entire operation because he was the most intelligent among them. However, keep in mind that Willie Turner is different from Willie Jones, whom I mentioned earlier as one of the 6 escapees. In reality, Willie Turner did not escape, despite being the primary orchestrator of the entire plan. We will discuss this point further later. Willie Turner distributed the weapons and knives he made among his accomplices and instructed them to prepare for the plan, which would commence shortly. The plan began with the book. As mentioned earlier, the gate guard took the book from the first inmate, left the control room, leaving the door slightly ajar, retrieved the book, and went to the opposite door to deliver it to the second inmate in the other cell area. When he handed the book to the second inmate, James Briley, James raised his voice and said, "Thank you for the book." He raised his voice because this was the signal Earl Clanton, hiding in the bathroom, was waiting for. As soon as Clanton heard the phrase, "Thank you for the book," he quickly emerged from the bathroom, entered the gate control room, and pressed a button to open the cell area gates. Instantly, all the doors opened, and pandemonium ensued. The inmates drew their weapons and attacked the guards in the blink of an eye. The roles reversed. The guards became the prisoners, and the prisoners became the guards. Within minutes, the inmates had full control of Section C, restraining every guard present and taking their uniforms, leaving them in their underwear. They confiscated their batons, wallets, and money now that the inmates controlled Section C and isolated it from the rest of the prison's buildings, and sections. The next step was to capture a high-ranking officer. The guards they currently held were powerless to issue orders, such as opening the main gate or similar commands. They needed a high-ranking officer to execute these tasks. So, they forced one of the guards to contact one of the prison supervisors. This supervisor held the rank of lieutenant. Under threat, they compelled the guard to inform the lieutenant of an emergency in Section C, claiming one of the inmates had suffered a severe injury due to a fight with another inmate. The guard requested the lieutenant to come and assess the situation personally. However, the lieutenant was in another building far from Section C and couldn't arrive quickly. Instead, he sent the duty officer, who held a lower rank than the lieutenant. When the officer entered Section C, he saw the guard in the gate control room and asked to be let in. Unbeknownst to the officer, this wasn't a guard, but one of the inmates disguised in a guard's uniform, pretending to be the gatekeeper. The officer was surprised when the inmates ambushed him, restraining him without any chance to resist or contact anyone outside. Using this same method, the inmates continued luring guards and officers of various ranks into Section C. Whenever a guard or officer arrived, they captured him, took his uniform, and imprisoned him with the others. Not only officers were captured, even the nurse supervising their section was taken. She was naturally terrified and eventually locked in a cell. Later, one of the criminals, Clanton, entered her cell, intending to assault her. The nurse began screaming for help, and the restrained guards heard her cries, fueling their anger and boiling blood in the cell. Leno Briley joined Clanton in assaulting the nurse, but soon another inmate entered the cell and began reprimanding them for their actions. Then Willie Turner, the mastermind, entered and said, "Is this what you intend to do now, in the middle of our operation? Do you have no brains?" The criminals stopped what they were attempting and left the nurse alone. Naturally, the nurse recounted these events during the investigators' interrogation of the guards, helping them reconstruct the sequence of events mentally. However, the criminals were still at large, leaving no trace up to this point. 2 hours had passed since the escape, and the police knew that the longer time elapsed, the harder it would become to locate them. They continuously expanded the search radius every half hour, with all resources and personnel from various law enforcement agencies in the state actively participating in the search. Yet, all efforts proved futile. There was no sign of the criminals. The investigators continued interrogating the guards and prison officers. Each guard recounted how they were detained and restrained by inmates disguised in guards' uniforms. Every time they captured a guard, they took his uniform to disguise themselves further, luring more guards into their trap. According to the guards' testimonies, James Briley, one of the brothers, wanted to kill some guards, fearing the difficulty of subduing them. However, Willie Turner, the operations mastermind, convinced him to abandon the idea, arguing that additional murders would only complicate matters further. Now, let's return to the lieutenant supervising the prison, the same one contacted initially, but who sent the duty officer instead. The lieutenant tried to reach the guards in Section C to check on the situation, but he received no response. Number 1 answered the phone, and even the officer he sent to assess the situation didn't return to inform him of what happened. Perplexed, the lieutenant decided to visit Section C personally to investigate. Upon entering the section through the stairwell door, he had keys to all doors. Being the supervisor, he found the place in complete disarray. After entering, the door automatically locked behind him. Suddenly, as he surveyed the area, the inmates, still disguised as guards, ambushed and restrained him, detaining him with the others. Now that they had a high-ranking officer, a lieutenant, facilitating all operations, Kay decided to initiate their escape from the prison. The first thing they did was lock the guards in the janitor's room located in Section C and close the door on them. The only person they took with them was the lieutenant. They were still in Section C, which was located in Building 1. They controlled the gate control room that operated Section C's doors. There was another control room at the main entrance of Building 1, governing the building's main gate. This room was manned by a guard on duty and secured with doors from all sides. The inmates couldn't access it unless the guard opened the doors for them. To get the guard to open the doors, they forced the lieutenant to contact her and claim. Another guard would relieve her. Naturally, as soon as she heard the voice, she recognized it as the lieutenant's without a doubt. Although the request was unusually guard coming to replace her mid-shift, she didn't suspect anything since her direct superior was issuing the order. Why would she question it? Clanton and Derek Peterson then approached the gate control room at the building entrance. When the guard saw them, she opened the door immediately, unaware they were inmates disguised as guards. How could she know, especially since her boss had just informed her that a guard would take her place? Entered, seized the guard, restrained her, and thus gained control of all the building's doors. However, a significant obstacle remained the main external gate, consisting of two gates that shouldn't open simultaneously, but with the lieutenant in their possession, they could issue any command. They made the lieutenant contact the external gate guard, informing him of a bomb in Section C, and ordering him to open both gates and drive a prison van inside. As discussed earlier in the introduction, the guard believed the story, likely influenced by the anonymous letter warning of a bomb in Section C sent 2 months prior. We discussed that letter and the search campaigns conducted by the guards based on it. Thus, the scenario became more believable, and as we mentioned, the inmates likely wrote that letter themselves to plant the idea in the guards' minds for the escape operation. The gate guard followed the lieutenant's order, opened both gates, and drove a prison van inside, heading to Building 1. Meanwhile, one of the inmates grabbed a small TV from one of their cells. The plan was to cover it with a blanket and pretend it was a bomb. We must clarify that not all inmates participating in the operation were escaping. Some had to stay behind in the control rooms to operate the doors. Moreover, not all wanted to escape, but were eager to participate in the operation. Life in prison was monotonous, and any change was welcome. Even Willie Turner, considered the mastermind, didn't escape with them. Apparently, he had an appeal pending for his death sentence and wanted to await the outcome. Thus, he chose to stay in prison so as not to forfeit his appeal. However, given his involvement in the escape and aiding his accomplices, with many witnesses to these acts, it's likely his appeal wouldn't succeed. Honestly, I'm unsure what he was thinking. Those who escaped were 6 individuals, the 6 we discussed earlier. Before leaving Building 1, they stormed a room containing riot gear equipment designated for guards. They took some helmets, shields, and a stretcher intended for injured personnel, placing the TV on it and covering it with a blanket to simulate a bomb. Once they donned the heavy helmets and gear, their identities were further concealed. Any guard seeing them outside would assume they were a special unit. Thus, the main gate guard brought the van and parked it at the entrance of Building 1. Naturally, the guard was unaware of what was truly happening inside. What he knew was that there was a bomb inside the building. Suddenly, the inmates emerged in disguise, shouting at the guard to flee because they had a live and dangerous bomb that could explode at any moment. One of them even sprayed a fire extinguisher. The poor guard believed them, assuming they were a specialized bomb squad, and fled immediately. The inmates then quickly boarded the van and, with ease, drove out through the open prison gates. This is the escape story and the details investigators gathered from interrogating the guards. Ultimately, the investigators suspected that one or more guards had collaborated with the inmates. The real tragedy lay in their performance and the foolish mistakes they made, which the inmates knew how to exploit. Unfortunately, interrogating the guards and obtaining all these details provided no clue about where the inmates had gone after escaping. The search outside continued intensively, and by now, 3 hours had passed since the inmates escaped without finding any trace of them, meaning they could have traveled great distances from the prison. Let's now examine, the events from the perspective of the 6 escaped inmates. After leaving the prison, they continued driving the van on the road for a while, feeling elated by their significant success. This euphoria apparently made them forget they were driving a prison van bearing the facility's logo and name. As they drove along, they passed a policeman who was on his routine nightly patrol. The officer saw them, and they greeted him, and he returned the greeting. You might wonder, didn't I say every policeman in the state was looking for them? Did this officer not know? The reason is that this policeman was in another state. Yes, the inmates managed to leave Virginia, where the prison was located, and entered North Carolina. Law enforcement in North Carolina hadn't yet received the news, especially since this encounter occurred within the first hour of the escape. By then, the news hadn't spread widely. Naturally, when the officers saw the prison van, he assumed they were officers transporting inmates, as they were wearing guards' uniforms. Nighttime prisoner transfers were common to remain discreet and secure, preventing anyone from discovering the operation and obstructing the vehicle. Following this encounter with the officer, the inmates snapped out of their euphoria and remembered they were driving a prison van that could expose them. They began debating among themselves about their destination and how to dispose of the van. One suggested finding a forest, driving the van between trees, and covering it with branches. However, this process would take time, and they were tense and fearful of being caught due to the van. After driving for a while, they reached a small town called Winton, where they spotted a somewhat secluded spot among the trees. They decided to stop the van there. After hastily exiting the vehicle, they split into 2 groups. The first group consisted of 4 individuals, the Briley brothers, along with Willie Jones and Lem Tuggle. The second group included Earl Clanton and Derek Peterson. The 4 in the first group continued running through the trees and forests, fortunate to find clothes hanging on a laundry line in front of one of the houses. They removed the guards' uniforms they were wearing and put on regular clothes to better conceal themselves. By this moment, 3.5 hours had passed since the start of the escape operation. Finally, after all these hours, the police managed to obtain their first lead. A patrol car was passing near the location where the inmates had abandoned the van. Naturally, news of the escape had now spread, and even the police in North Carolina had received the information. When this officer saw the van with the name Mecklenburg Correctional Facility on it, he immediately called for backup. Police arrived, cautiously approached the van, and eventually discovered it was empty. They realized the inmates had abandoned it and were now on foot. Inside the van, they found the helmets and items the inmates had used. The van was 50 kilometers away from the prison, outside the area the police had been searching. Naturally, the news reached the authorities and the investigators handling the case immediately. The Search Operations Center was promptly relocated to North Carolina, specifically to the town of Winton, where the van was found. This became a joint operation between law enforcement agencies in both Virginia and North Carolina. Additionally, the FBI was called in to lead the investigation and take charge of the case, as it had now become a federal matter since the inmates had crossed state lines. The investigators immediately assumed the inmates had split into smaller groups because staying together in one group would increase the likelihood of capture. A logical assumption was that they had separated. Alerts about the inmates reached all parts of the state and the entire country. Even the FBI warned all law enforcement agencies nationwide. It's provided information that 6 death row inmates had escaped from prison, so that all agencies would be vigilant if one of these inmates entered their area or state. Caters at the Operations Center were calculating distances, studying maps, and trying to predict the locations and distances the inmates could cover each minute. Simultaneously, They began gathering information about the inmates, their families, and the people they had contacted or called while in prison. The most likely scenario was that the criminals would seek refuge with their families, relatives, or friends. The police also established a dedicated hotline to receive any reports about these criminals around dawn. Approximately, the police received a report from someone stating that their pickup truck had been stolen from in front of their house. This person lived in the same small town, Winton. Within moments, the police and investigators rushed to the house. The first thing they did was ask about the truck. He described it as a blue pickup with some red on the back, easily identifiable because of its distinctive license plate number, BAA1. He also mentioned it was full of fuel, meaning if the inmates had indeed stolen it, it could potentially take them far. The police immediately issued an alert about the truck, but realized they needed to expand the search radius again, possibly by hundreds of kilometers, since having a vehicle meant the inmates could go anywhere. They also needed to reinforce warnings to law enforcement agencies in other states, especially neighboring ones, as the inmates could reach any state by morning. Morning came, and the sun rose, yet there was still no trace of the escaped inmates anywhere. The police set up checkpoints on all roads, especially around the town of Winton. Every vehicle was stopped and searched. All security officers in the area were recruited for this mission, from traffic officers to special forces, without exception. There were no budget constraints or limitations on the tools they could use. Helicopters filled the sky, officers scoured the ground, cars patrolled the streets, and dogs searched tirelessly. Despite all these efforts, they still couldn't find any trace of them. However, this massive search operation had an unintended consequence that the police hadn't anticipated. The citizens of the town became terrified. Imagine waking up to the sound of helicopters and police cars, then stepping outside to find police checkpoints everywhere. Soon after, they learned from the news that 6 dangerous murderers had escaped from prison and had been in their town the previous night. God only knows if they were still there. The people of Winton were terrified, fearing for their lives, scared of encountering one of these criminals on the street. These were criminals with nothing to lose, capable of killing anyone if they saw fit. Even the residents of neighboring counties and areas became frightened because, according to the news, the criminals could be anywhere, possibly in their region too, adding to the fear. The media and TV channels began discussing the past crimes of these criminals, the heinous acts they had committed, including assaults on elderly women in their 70s, the murder of entire families, and even the killing of a 5-year-old child after his parents were murdered in front of him. Imagine the terror among the populace as they absorbed these stories and realized these killers could be among them without anyone knowing. Residents of Winton and surrounding areas began flocking to gun shops in a frenzy, buying firearms and ammunition. The situation escalated to the point where gun stores were completely sold out. No guns or bullets remained. Everything was gone. There was a lot of tension and fear. I remember people talking about having their guns ready, saying they would shoot anyone who stepped onto their property. Some merchants in the small town apparently got cleaned out of guns. There was no ammunition left. The additional problem was that people were afraid even of the police officers and law enforcement. Why? Because they knew the criminals were disguised as guards. How could they be sure the officer in front of them wasn't one of these criminals? When the police sometimes knocked on doors to ask questions or conduct investigations, they faced significant difficulties. People refused to cooperate or even open their doors. Many fortified themselves inside their homes, locking doors and refusing to open them for anyone. Many didn't sleep for several nights or took turns staying awake within their families, ensuring someone was always alert and armed. Naturally, the police tried to assist the people, especially women and the elderly who needed groceries or essentials, but were too scared to go out themselves. and had no one to fetch items for them. The police helped by bringing them supplies from stores or supermarkets themselves. Generally, the townsfolk in surrounding areas were terrified, and this reflected in the calls reaching the police. They received a tremendous number of calls and reports, despite the large number of forces participating in the operation. However, they couldn't keep up with all the reports. Every minute, they received a call from someone claiming to have seen one of the criminals somewhere, *, finally, on the same day, June 1st, 1984. At exactly 5 p.m., Merle Clanton and Derek Peterson were casually walking through the town's streets in broad daylight. At 5 p.m., I'm not sure if they lost their minds or were trying to act smart by walking confidently, as if walking boldly through the street would prevent anyone from suspecting them. Naturally, they had discarded the guards' uniforms and changed in 2 different clothes, though one of them, Clanton, still wore the guard's jacket, but had removed its logos and insignias. I guess he liked the jacket style and decided to keep it. The 2 entered a laundromat. They have such laundromats in America where machines operate with coins. You insert coins into the washer to use it. These 2 weren't entering the laundromat to wash clothes. They were looking for a somewhat hidden place to eat. They had purchased food from a grocery store and were starving. They searched for any nearby place to eat and found only this laundromat, deeming it a suitable, somewhat concealed spot. Unfortunately for them, at that very moment, one of the security patrols was passing by the laundromat. This wasn't an ordinary police patrol, but belonged to the leader of the prison's emergency team. The leader was highly familiar with the prison guards' uniforms. As soon as he glanced to the laundromat, he immediately noticed the jacket Clanton was wearing. Though it lacked the usual logos and insignias of a guard's uniform, he instantly recognized it by its color and design. He turned the car toward the laundromat, and he and his assistant drew their weapons, entered, and found Clanton and his companion Peterson sitting and eating. He ordered them to raise their hands and face the wall, tip the period of freedom. 2 had enjoyed outside lasted just 19 hours. They hadn't even completed a full day, so real footage shots capturing their arrest inside the laundromat. Notice how people and journalists gathered around the scene. While this should have been generally good news, it was also terrifying, especially for the townsfolk. Finding 2 of the criminals casually walking through the streets and entering shops made even those who weren't previously frightened become terrified. Suddenly, they realized the criminals could indeed be among them without anyone knowing. The investigators were particularly afraid of the Briley brothers because, as we mentioned, they were the most vicious among the group of criminals. Classified as serial killers, they had committed repeated murders and assaults without reason. In one instance, they killed a pregnant woman. In another, they assaulted and killed a 79-year-old woman and her husband. In yet another instance, they killed a 5-year-old child along with his family, among other brutal and violent crimes. Moreover, they showed no remorse whatsoever. Naturally, these 2 were at the top of the police and investigators' list. The search operations continued, and the police endured immense challenges with the overwhelming number of calls they were receiving. Despite the flood of reports, security forces tried as much as possible to verify as many as they could, especially those that seemed promising. They searched through forests, mud, swamps, lakes, and abandoned houses, leaving no stone unturned. Nevertheless, none of the reports yielded useful results in the end. Without these reports, the police's efforts persisted. On that night, at 11 p.m., in the city of Portsmouth, Virginia, approximately 300 miles away from Winton, where the prison van was found, a police patrol was on the road when they spotted 2 individuals attempting to steal a car. One of the officers exited the vehicle and ordered the 2 men, or rather criminals, to raise their hands. However, the 2 men suddenly fled, and when the officer tried to pursue them, they fired at him. It was later confirmed that these two individuals were the Briley brothers. The shooting confirmed the investigators' fears. These two were willing to kill even the police to preserve their freedom. They wouldn't hesitate. If they were ready to kill a police officer, imagine what they'd do if they encountered an ordinary citizen and saw an advantage in killing or harming them. Undoubtedly, they wouldn't hesitate at all. It was only a matter of time before they killed again if they remained at large. The second issue now was that they were identified in a city 300 miles away from the search operations center in Winton, where the prison van was found. Authorities concluded that the search operations in these areas were futile. The criminals had likely moved far away from these regions. Therefore, the investigators needed to find alternative methods to track them down. The first thought that came to mind was monitoring people connected to their families and relatives. The FBI reviewed the call records from the prison and examined the numbers and individuals the Briley brothers had contacted while incarcerated. However, they noticed that many of the numbers and names were random. Every time they checked a name or number, it turned out to be unrelated to the brothers, neither closely nor distantly. This indicated that the Briley brothers had provided false information about the numbers and people they contacted while in prison. They were deliberately concealing the identities and numbers of those they communicated with. So, the FBI obtained call records directly from the telecommunications company, which had the real numbers and names of the people the Briley brothers had contacted from prison. After reviewing the records, the investigators identified the true identities of these individuals. The person the Briley brothers contacted most frequently was their uncle. The FBI went to this uncle's house, but kept monitoring him from a distance without questioning him to avoid arousing suspicion. If they had alerted him, he might have warned the Briley brothers, allowing them to escape again. A permanent surveillance team was assigned to monitor this uncle and track all his movements. They knew the Briley brothers were unlikely to stay at his house, but might meet or communicate with him in some other way. The idea was to keep monitoring the uncle until the moment he contacted or met with them. They continued to observe and follow every move he made for several days. Let's return to this later and see what happened after this surveillance operation. But now, let's go back to the other inmates. During these days, when the FBI was monitoring the uncle, the police obtained a new lead related to the other criminals, Lim Tuggle and Willie Jones. These two took 8 days to reach the state of Vermont, which borders Canada. They were hiding there in one of the forests in Mant, with the goal of reaching Canada. They were staying in the woods, spending their nights there. However, they faced a problem. The pickup truck they had was low on fuel and needed refilling to continue their journey to Canada. This pickup truck, if you recall, was stolen on the first night after abandoning the prison van. It was taken from a resident of Winton. The owner of the truck had told the police it was blue with some red on the back and had a distinctive license plate number, BA-1. The following morning, Gus, ed, a cup ek, it us, it did, ed, I, suk, I, Lim Tuggle and Willie Jones. They said someone would pass by to pick them up and take them along. Lim Tuggle and Willie Jones took the pickup truck and headed toward the state of Vermont, which, as mentioned, borders Canada with the intention of reaching it. However, they now needed fuel for the truck. Lim Tuggle left Willie Jones in the forest and drove the truck to the nearest town, specifically to a shop selling antiques and gifts. He entered the shop and began speaking with the female shopkeeper. Moments later, he pulled out a knife, threatened her, and demanded all the money she had. The shopkeeper, having no choice, complied with the threat and handed over the cash. Lim Tuggle then left the shop, ran to the truck, and drove off. However, the shopkeeper managed to note the truck's appearance, license plate, which was BAA1K, and immediately contacted the police to report the incident. Lim Tuggle had taken about $80 from the shopkeeper. Not a large sum, but enough for fuel to continue their journey to Canada. His plan was to return to Willie Jones, who was waiting for him in the forest, and then proceed together to Canada. Unfortunately for him, the police response to the shopkeeper's call was faster than expected. Upon receiving the report, the police recognized the truck as stolen and suspected it might be linked to the prison escape operation that every officer in the country had heard about. The town where this incident occurred was small, with few people and limited roads. A policeman patrolling in an unmarked car spotted the reported truck passing by from the opposite direction. Immediately, he turned his vehicle around, activated the police lights, sounded the siren, and began the pursuit. Lim Tuggle, of course, did not stop and kept accelerating, trying to escape. However, the pursuing officer alerted other nearby officers about their location. Another patrol car, close to the area, quickly moved to intercept the fugitive. The second officer's plan was to create a roadblock, as Lim Tuggle approached from one direction and the officer from the opposite. The latter positioned his car across the road, got out, and aimed his weapon at the oncoming vehicle. The police were acutely aware of the danger. It had been confirmed that this man was likely one of the condemned escapees from the Mecklenburg Correctional Facility. The situation was tense, especially since these officers were in a rural area, unaccustomed to high-speed chases and armed confrontations. Would this criminal stop when he saw the police car blocking the road and the officer pointing a gun at him? Or would he resist? The officer was fully focused. The criminal refused to stop. He was prepared to shoot, aiming to incapacitate before the suspect could reach his vehicle. Fortunately, Lim Tuggle stopped the truck when he reached the roadblock. Unlike others in his positions, such as the Briley brothers, who would have undoubtedly kept driving, he assessed his options and realized surrender was the best choice. He was arrested by the police, and this is a real photograph capturing the moment of his arrest. Later, Lim Tuggle expressed regret for robbing the shop and wished he had chosen a different target. Perhaps, deep down, he even wished he had killed the shopkeeper before leaving, because, had he done so, she wouldn't have reported him, and he wouldn't have been caught. Of course, he didn't say this outright, but I'm sure it crossed his mind. In the end, this was a condemned man who had already murdered 2 elderly women. Someone like him surely wouldn't hesitate to kill again. The next day, the police managed to arrest his companion, Willie Jones, who had been waiting for him in the forest. However, the way they apprehended him was strange and unexpected. You might assume that Lim Tuggle had informed on him, but that wasn't the case. Instead, Willie Jones turned himself in. That day, he called the emergency hotline and told the operator his name was Willie Jones, a condemned prisoner who had escaped from prison. He said he was exhausted and wanted to surrender. The operator, naturally surprised, asked for his location. Willie provided a description of where he was, though he didn't know the exact address. Based on his description, the operator determined his location and assured him that a patrol car would be sent to pick him up. Willie replied that he would stand by the side of the road, clearly visible, true to his word. When the patrol car arrived at the described location, they found Willie Jones standing by the roadside, waving at them. It was a surreal scene. Imagine a condemned prisoner who had escaped from jail now voluntarily surrendering. Willie Jones told the police he was unarmed, but they approached him cautiously nonetheless. Eventually, he was arrested when the investigators questioned him about why he surrendered. Willie explained that he had been wandering alone in the forest, waiting for Lim Tuggle. After an entire day passed without his partner returning, he assumed something had happened to him or that he had fled to Canada alone. Willie was confused, unsure what to do, and in a difficult situation. He was stranded in the forest, bitten by insects, starving and unable to find food. Reaching his breaking point, he decided to turn himself in. The tragic irony for Willie Jones was that he later discovered he had been just a few kilometers away from Canada. He could have easily walked there, as the border wasn't heavily guarded, except along the highways. There were countless places he could have crossed into Canada and started a new life, especially in the 1980s when everything was paper-based and computer systems weren't widespread. But alas, he didn't know where to go, and by the time he surrendered, it was too late. At this point, 4 of the 6 escaped prisoners had been captured, but unfortunately, the 2 most dangerous ones, the Briley brothers, were still at large. Investigators interrogated Lim Tuggle about their whereabouts. He admitted that they had been together on the first day and stolen the pickup truck together, but they had separated the next morning. Beyond that, he had no idea where they might have gone, with no leads or clues pointing to the Briley brothers. The FBI was left with only one option: to continue monitoring their uncle, whom we mentioned earlier. They were confident that the brothers would eventually contact or meet with him, as their investigations revealed he was the person they most frequently called from prison. For several days, they followed the uncle, keeping a close watch on his movements, but every day yielded negative results, no contact or meetings with the brothers. Finally, patience paid off. One day, while tailing him, they noticed him visiting an auto repair shop specializing in car maintenance and customization. To their surprise, a woman filed a report with the police stating that James Briley had contacted her. When investigators traced the number he used, it led them back to the same repair shop. This was no coincidence. The uncle's presence at the shop and the brothers' connection to it were undeniable. The shop owner, it turned out, knew the Briley brothers through their uncle, who had introduced them under fake names. Because the uncle and the shop owner were friends, the uncle had arranged for the brothers to work there. The FBI placed special surveillance on the shop, suspecting its involvement. For days, they monitored the location without any results. However, on June 19, 1984, one of the surveillance officers spotted 2 men working on a car outside the shop. These men resembled the Briley brothers, but the investigators weren't 100% certain of their identities. To confirm, they sent an undercover informant from the same neighborhood to approach and converse with them casually. The informant successfully engaged them in conversation without arousing suspicion. He returned to the investigators and confirmed that one of the men was indeed James Briley, though the second man wasn't his brother. Now, the investigators at least had James's location, but the challenge was capturing both brothers without alerting the other. If Leno, James's brother, learned of the arrest, he might flee. At the same time, they feared losing James if he sensed anything amiss. Fortunately, on the evening of that same day, they confirmed that Leno was also inside the shop. It appeared the brothers were hosting a small gathering with a group of acquaintances and friends. The police acted swiftly. Once they confirmed both brothers were present, they stormed the location. Everyone inside was shocked, especially the Briley brothers. When the police entered with weapons drawn and ordered everyone to get on the ground, all the attendees immediately complied except the Briley brothers. Out of shock, they remained standing, frozen and unsure what to do. In those moments, they likely debated whether to surrender or attempt an escape. But the reality was that escape was impossible. The police had them completely surrounded, weapons trained on them, and they knew the brothers were dangerous fugitives. Any wrong move would result in immediate gunfire. After taking a moment to assess the situation and realize there was no way out, the Briley brothers finally dropped to the ground with the others. The scene was chaotic and loud, even startling. The shop owner, who was in his office. The brothers were finally arrested after a 19-day manhunt. Thankfully, during this period, no one was harmed or killed by them. With this, the manhunt came to an end. All 6 escaped prisoners had been captured. To ensure the Briley brothers couldn't escape again, special measures were taken, although they were arrested in another state, which typically would require coordination between states for extradition. An exception was made. The FBI retained custody of the Briley brothers until they could be returned to Virginia. In response to the escape, significant changes were implemented at the Mecklenburg Correctional Facility. The prison was placed under lockdown. No new inmates were admitted, and no one was released for any reason. The governor of Virginia fired 5 guards and suspended the warden and assistant warden without pay indefinitely. The prison had been unstable ever since the escape. Riots became frequent, and tensions between inmates and guards escalated. On one occasion, 2 guards were stabbed with handmade knives. Such incidents weren't uncommon at Mecklenburg, but after the escape, the frequency and intensity of riots increased dramatically. This created chaos in the prison's administration, leading to staff changes and reforms aimed at preventing any similar escape attempts in the future. For example, bathroom doors were kept locked at all times, and guards issued keys to inmates only when necessary. Any guard violating protocols was immediately dismissed. The double external gates were upgraded with an electronic system ensuring they could never open simultaneously. Overall, the prison administration enforced all rules and protocols strictly, no matter how minor, and violators among the guards were promptly terminated. As for the 6 escaped prisoners, their fates were sealed. Following the escape, the state expedited the execution of death sentences. Previously, inmates might wait years, undergoing appeals or retrials, but after this incident, authorities prioritized carrying out executions. The first to be executed was Leno Briley, who was electrocuted in 1984. 6 months later, his brother James followed, meeting the same fate. During the same period, several other prisoners unrelated to the escape were also executed. The rate of executions rose significantly of the remaining 4 escapees. Earl Clanton was executed in 1988, followed by Derek Peterson in 1991. Willie Jones was executed in 1993. And the last, Lem Tuggle, faced execution in 1996. By then, the electric chair had been replaced with lethal injection. So, Lem Tuggle was executed using this method. As for Willie Turner, the mastermind behind the escape, who didn't flee with the others, his appeal failed, and he was executed in 1995 via lethal injection. In the end, every prisoner involved in the escape or present in Section C during the operation was executed sooner or later. Justice, in its own way, had prevailed. And with that, we've reached the conclusion of our story. Honestly, this was one of the most challenging videos I've worked on. Preparing for it took a long time, and filming stretched over many hours, turning night into day. If I told you about all the mishaps during filming, you wouldn't believe MIT was one of the worst recording sessions I've experienced. First, my camera was connected to electricity, and midway through filming, the power went out. The camera shut off while recording, corrupting some files, and I had to redo parts of the video. To avoid further issues, I switched to battery power, but forgot to press the record button, talking for several minutes without realizing the camera wasn't capturing anything. Thankfully, I noticed and resumed recording, and the rest of the session went smoothly. See you tomorrow.